The Oxford Dictionary defines power as the ability or capacity to act or do something in a particular way, as well as influence the behavior of others or the course of events. How does this compare to the definition you wrote in your lesson preview, historians? Did you mention a superhero or a supervillain maybe? Your favorite athlete or artist? Perhaps the president, or heck, maybe even yourself? We often portray heroes and villains as waging epic battles, honing and using their powers to create the changes they wish to see in the world, whether we find them inspiring or appalling. The study of history is also the study of power, of who's had it, of who hasn't, of how it's impacted the lives of your ancestors and even your own. So when we talk about giant empires like those of the Romans, the Ottomans, the Spanish, the Mongols, the British, and even the ones that still exist today, power is at the heart of our discussions. Last time, we learned what lengths Napoleon took to build his own empire and just how shaky its foundations were. Today, we'll focus on the decisions he made that led to its eventual collapse and how his desire for power may have played a role. Here are today's guiding questions as well as our big picture question. What was the purpose of Napoleon's continental system and did it achieve its ultimate goal? What French military expeditions led to the decline of the French Empire? How did Napoleon respond to his empire's collapse? And our big picture question, is there such a thing as too much power? All right, let's go. You might remember that although Napoleon's ruthlessness and military expertise allowed him to quickly seize control of most of Europe, there was one annoying rock he could never quite get out of his shoe: Great Britain. Even after he solidified an alliance with Austria by marrying a member of their royal family and naming their son Napoleon II the King of Rome, he still couldn't outmight or outmaneuver the British. So he devised what we now call the continental system. This was essentially a naval blockade or closing of ports to prevent all trade and communication between Britain and the rest of Europe. What do you think were Napoleon's ultimate goals of this system? The main goals of this system were to destroy Britain's commercial and industrial economy as well as make Europe more self-sufficient or less dependent on British goods. But was it successful though? The continental system had its fair share of weaknesses that kept it from truly destroying the British economy. 1. Smugglers were able to sneak cargo from Britain to Europe fairly easily. 2. Some of his allies ignored the blockade and continued to trade with Britain, even members of his own family like his brother Louis, King of Holland. 3. And perhaps most importantly, the British Navy continued to assert its dominance over Napoleon's. So while Britain's exports to the continent did indeed fall 25 to 55% compared to their pre-1806 levels, they were able to cover that decline due to these weaknesses. While frustrating, the failure of the continental system didn't singularly doom Napoleon's plans to overtake the British. Before we get to what else contributed, let's review. What was the purpose of Napoleon's continental system and did it achieve its ultimate goal? While some countries snuck around the continental system's restrictions, others, like Portugal, openly refused to comply and even aligned themselves with Great Britain. As you'd expect, Napoleon did not take this defiance lightly. He responded by marching French troops through Spain with plans to reach Portugal and coerce them into complying with his system. However, the Spanish government, led by King Ferdinand VII, did not appreciate Napoleon's incursion. Napoleon consequently removed Ferdinand from the throne, leaving his own brother Joseph in charge. This didn't go over well with the Spanish people. A predominantly Catholic population, many worried that Napoleon would wreak havoc on the church next. So Spanish peasant guerrilla fighters took up arms and fought Napoleon's troops for the next 6 years. They relied heavily on ambush attacks and support from British troops who had come to defend the Portuguese borders after the Portuguese royal family fled to Brazil. Ultimately forced, or coerced, to accept defeat, Napoleon recalled his troops back to France, having lost over 300,000 soldiers during the conflict, taking a heavy toll on the French army. Yet, Spain and Portugal weren't the only countries that had issues with the continental system. Led by Tsar Alexander I, Russia continued to sell grain to Britain, even though it claimed to be Napoleon's ally. Aside from the tensions growing from this stark refusal, both Napoleon and Alexander maintained a deep skepticism of one another, and suspected the other of wanting to control the Duchy of Warsaw, or modern-day Poland. These suspicions eventually materialized into Napoleon leading over 650,000 French troops into Russia. However, as the French advanced, Russian troops responded by using scorched earth tactics in their retreat. When Napoleon finally reached Moscow, he found a wasteland, as Alexander had essentially burnt the city to the ground. Without any resources or shelter, Napoleon and his troops suddenly found themselves faced with the prospect of surviving a harsh Russian winter. As his troops retreated, they found themselves under the sudden attack of Russian troops as they struggled to fight through exhaustion, hunger, and the bitter cold. In the end, only 10,000 soldiers made it back, just 1% of the original 600,000 French troops that left for Moscow. Haunted by this defeat, Napoleon now found himself at war with almost all of the major European powers, even Austria, which he had considered an ally given his marriage to Marie-Louise. Napoleon responded with a desperate attempt to raise another army, but lacked the time to properly train them. But his troops were quickly overwhelmed by Allied European forces at the Battle of Leipzig in 1813. As Frederick William III of Prussia and Alexander I led their troops into Paris, Napoleon insisted not all was lost, but his generals disagreed. So, Napoleon finally threw in the towel, abdicating his throne in the process and accepting the terms of surrender that saw him exiled to a small island off the Italian coast, Elba. Finally, Europe had humbled the military mastermind and left him defeated, never to rise again. Well, that's what they thought, at least. Time for a quick review. What French military expeditions led to the decline of the French Empire? Yep, Napoleon wouldn't go down without a fight. Or another one, that is. You see, his predecessors, the royal family, didn't disappear in those years during and after the Revolution. So when the empire fell and there was a sudden vacancy for head of state, Louis XVIII, Louis XVI's brother, stepped in and was declared king. Yet many peasants remained wary of Louis and thought he would undermine the revolution's land reforms. Hoping to capitalize off the discontent with the barely christened king, Napoleon escaped from Elba in 1815 and was welcomed back by throngs of adoring French citizens. He quickly whipped another army together and declared himself emperor. In response, the Allies rounded up their armies yet again. But this attempt to regain the reins of power in Europe was short-lived. Just a few months later, he was defeated by British and Prussian forces at the Battle of Waterloo. Elbe was a little too close for comfort after Napoleon's last escape, so this time they exiled him to St. Helena, a remote island in the middle of the South Atlantic Ocean, where he'd spend the last 6 years of life before succumbing to an illness. Just like that, the man who some considered the most powerful human being in Europe at one point passed away in near obscurity. Before we reflect on Napoleon's significance, let's review. How did Napoleon respond to his empire's collapse? While he isn't the first person in history whose desire for power severely shaped his successes and ultimately his defeats, he does encourage us to stop and ask ourselves, Is there such a thing as too much power? The European allies found themselves faced with similar questions as they wondered just how they could prevent another Napoleon from arising. Tune in next time to see what they tried in the end, and remember, history is everywhere.